Serious, what's the scariest thing you lived through? Steroid-induced psychosis. I have brain cancer and had to take dexamethasone, and I had a super rare reaction where I went crazy and was having hallucinations which made me think I was trapped in hell. I don't remember most of what took place, but from what I do remember it was absolutely terrifying. This is so much less than what you went through, but a few years ago I had a bad flu and had nightmares for days where I was trapped in essentially H.R. Giger paintings, just awful machine-like hellscapes, and I was always frantic trying to escape. It felt like my brains was being overclocked too. My father was a drug dealer, alcoholic and a pedophile. It started on my 6th birthday. I found my voice at 19 when he decided we should have a baby. I told him I would tell the doctor if it happened. He whipped me with his belt until he drew blood and then got in the car and left. He was found by some poor person the next morning in the car after gassing himself. I remember the police driving down our driveway and my mom collapsing when they told us. I was elated. I've done years of therapy and I have a reasonable life, but I'll never be okay. My dad committed suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning and I found him. It was scary in that I didn't know what to do. I couldn't logically process at the time he was already dead, and I thought I could take some measure and save him. After being run over by a car, I have had amnesia 3 times. Third time was the scariest moment of my life. You know, you should know who you are, where you are, but there's a solid black wall between you and you. Lasted 4 hours. That does sound scary. Where were you when this happened? Like at home or out in public? Do you know what could have triggered it? My girlfriend overdosed. Finding her seizing will probably be a memory I have forever. Edit, she did survive thankfully. I found my grandmother about to fall down the stairs after having a stroke. When a volcano erupted, I was climbing towards it, after roughly 20 minutes and many kilometers of frenzied running. I should have been okay, but I'm from Saskatchewan, and we don't have volcanoes, so I had no idea. Added bonus, I'd had a mastectomy 4 weeks prior and wasn't supposed to do any exercise for another 2. On the lava rocks, I collapsed and ate shit. My 2-year-old being diagnosed with cancer, coming up on the 3rd anniversary of his diagnosis, and he's still fighting. But every once in a while the knowledge of how quickly it could go south hits me in this like wave of fear and panic and helpless desperation. The day he was diagnosed, I took him to his doctor cause he had this black eye that wasn't getting better. She is usually completely unflappable, but that morning she panicked and sent me to the children's hospital immediately. That was the worst car ride of my life, because I knew right then and there that our worst fears were true. Fuck cancer. I am so terribly sorry. I wish your son will go into remission and he fights it off well. And I wish you heal through all the pain. As much as things can go south, I wish you get the silver lining at the end. Heart, there is help. And there are people who'd listen. You are a wonderful mother and I hope your son makes a groundbreaking recovery. I was on a public transit bus to go to high school one morning. I usually walked, but it was so cold that day. So I'm on a bus, alone. It's like 6 a.m. and still dark because of winter. Dude gets on the bus. He could sit anywhere he wanted. He sits right behind me. He grabs my hair and sniffs it with this nasty sounding inhale. Keep in mind I'm 15. And I just hop off the bus and speed walk to my school. He got off and followed me. For this 2 to 3 minutes of walking I kept thinking of what my family would think if I went missing. I got to school safely, but yeah, I still think about that sometimes. Some of my parents' arguments. I'd never know when things would get physically violent. The anticipation killed me, not to mention the yelling and screaming. I have a hard time controlling my anger now. And poor communication skills. My dad was, no idea if he still is, physically abusive to my mom. Growing up, my sisters and I would hide in one of our closets when a fight would happen. We never witnessed my dad hit or choke my mom, but we know what it sounded like. Once we got older, we would step in and stop the fights. Thankfully my dad never put his hands on any of us kids. We have all moved out, so we really don't know if he's still the same. Hopefully us standing up to him kinda opened his eyes. My mother's mental illness and delusions when I was a kid. I remember one time when she made me and my sister sleep in bed with her because she saw demons hovering around our bedroom window, trying to get in. I woke up to find her staring down at me and my sister with a butcher knife in her hand. She was smiling, but there were tears running down her face. I just closed my eyes and pretended to sleep. Stuff like that. For years of our childhood, when she finally abandoned us, I felt so much guilt at how relieved and happy I felt that she was gone. Man, I'm sorry to hear you guys went through that. I hope you and your sis are doing better now. I'm sure there are also some subreddits and Discord servers where you can talk to people and perhaps talk with others. Since I know that talking with people Earl can leave you vulnerable to judgment. The one time I was in a car wreck, just the whole feeling of the forces of the impact, feeling like you are in slow-mo. The glass hitting your face, head hitting the airbag, and mostly the feeling of not being in control. But other than being hit by a truck, made it out okay, only a few cuts from the glass. And hashtag X200B, sorry bad spelling. Smiley face. My parents and I watched out the front windshield as a pickup turned perpendicularly into our lane on the highway, and just stopped. We had no time to really brake or even brace. Toned that sucker, flipping the truck like 3 times. Somehow everyone was okay. I had a black eye from hitting my face on my knee, an older car with waist seatbelts, and some pulled muscles that made it hard to walk for a few days. But somehow everyone made it out fine. The few seconds before impact were definitely filled with terror, but also acceptance that there was nothing that could change what was about to happen. Years later, my brother in his lowered Mazda Miata stopped at a stoplight behind a truck, looks in his rear view and sees an SUV coming at him at 60 miles per hour. The driver not looking forward, because of how low his car was compared to the SUV and the truck in front of him. He figured there was no way the SUV wasn't going to end up on top of his car, so he figured that was it for him. Somehow his trunk and front end got pancaked, but left him without a scratch. Car accidents are wild. My father is pedophile and, probably, a sociopath. He molested/raped my older sister who is now dead, in part because of that trauma. In 2004 he and my mom adopted my sister from China and he touched her from at least age 3. My mom finally got the guts to go to the cops in 2008. She had known since the late 90s what was going on but was terrified of my father, who repeatedly told her he would kill her and no one else would love her. After he went to prison our lives just fell apart. My mom was addicted to Valium and just wasn't there for us. Edit for clarity, 10 years later it just feels like I was in one of those CSI shows. Except the sociopath from the show is your dad. Please be on the lookout in your family and friends. We had the appearance of a normal American family, but in reality there was extreme darkness inside. I am like your sister. I was molested and technically raped by my biological father for 2 years, ages 14 to 16. My parents were divorced, but I had the fear of not telling anyone because my father was also physically abusive and my stepmother is not quite right in the head. I was afraid she would blame me for breaking up the family and being jealous of her or my half-brother. I do not doubt she did rant like this after it came out. I only said something when it happened to my stepsister. Was still blamed for not coming forward, and she was blamed for seducing her mother's husband by her own mother. Nothing came out of it despite both of us pressing charges. Years of CPS visits didn't find it either. We caught on pretty quickly that CPS turns a blind eye to kids in abusive situations when you live in a mansion and grow up upper middle class. Living with my mother would have been just as bad, as I suspect she has BPD and has used me as her emotional crutch and personal therapist for as long as I can remember. Over 20 years later, I still have PTSD and PTSD nightmares. It never goes away. So mine's not as extreme as some others, physically. But to me, getting type 1 diabetes in 5th grade really fucked me up mentally. It's been 15 years and only recently I honestly admitted I need help. Hard lockdown during middle school. One time in high school we had to go on lockdown because there was a gunman in the neighborhood around the school. This was in Florida, and the school was open-walled, I guess you'd say? So like, instead of all the classrooms being inside a building that had several doors to the outside, all the classrooms just led to an open hallway. Anyone could just walk right into the school at any point. So that was exciting. We were in one of the only classrooms that didn't have a window, and there was no window in the door either, but there were doors to the 2 surrounding classrooms. So like, if we were better or worse off than other classrooms if the shooter actually decided to come on campus. One other negative is this happened like right after A or B period lunch. So the kids who had C period lunch never got to eat because they kept us on lockdown until the end of the school day. One positive is we were in the computer lab, so we just got to dick around online to take our minds off possibly dying. We also had a lockdown during college because there was a hostage situation at a restaurant downtown. The college buildings are spread out all over the city, so they just decided to keep us all inside just in case. It's weird. I was way more rattled about that than about being on lockdown in high school with the gunman wandering the neighborhood. Typhoons in the Philippines. I could see rooftops blown away easily. One almost hit my apartment, but a light pole luckily was in the way to block it. The next morning, a ton of debris were in all walkways of my apartment and we couldn't leave our campus. Water and electricity were out for more than a week. Thank goodness my brother and I had personal lanterns we had brought from America. Not entirely sure if this fits, but here goes. Some years ago I was in law school and we started covering this one case in class that was pretty horrific. It was a murder that occurred at a local pub I knew. The killer had raped this woman in a bathroom, beaten her with a cast he had on his arm, took her out the emergency exit, dragged her to the beach and left her there on the sand passed out. She did not wake up. The tide came up several hours later, and she drowned. Anyway, I got home and told my mom how we had covered a case that was a murder that took place at the local pub. She quietly asked me the name of the case. I told her, and she started crying. Turns out the victim was her best friend, and my mom was out drinking with her that night. My mom said she headed home a bit early, but her friend wanted to stay. She had some real survivor's guilt around it, wondering whether if she'd stayed with her friend or had insisted that she not stay by herself, whether her friend would still be alive. Or maybe that could have been my mom who he grabbed, and then I probably would never have ended up being born. I've been in a situation like your mom. My friend wanted to continue the party after closing time with a group of out-of-town guys we had just met. Just her and I, and 6 male construction workers. I said I didn't feel safe and begged her to come home with me. She called me a party pooper and went alone. She was gang raped. Worst thing is she never reported it. Instead she blamed me, and to this day, she won't talk to me. I suffer survivor guilt too, but I try to remind myself it would have been the two of us gang raped had I gone. I also begged her not to. If she needs to blame me in order to deal with the pain, that's fine. But I don't need to carry the guilt on myself. Took me 20 years to come to that conclusion. I went through a school shooting. It doesn't bother me much anymore, but I still remember the shots, the screams, and all the kids crying and looking for their siblings, trying to get enough signal to call their parents. People who were so goofy and lighthearted that morning were sobbing on the ground. Others just looked numb. I'll never forget the one kid who was an ass to everyone, just sat down next to me, held my hand and told me that everything was going to be okay. Giving birth to my daughter who had died in my womb a few hours before. I had to pin my mother to the ground, getting kicked in the face in the process, and call an ambulance. She had gotten drunk and wanted to kill herself. She's bipolar. When the ambulance arrived, they called the police, because they didn't want to bring in a drunk person without injuries. The police said they couldn't take her with force unless I pressed charges. This was the first time my GF met my mother. Fell asleep driving through the desert after midnight. Woke up after 2 weeks in a coma, Glasgow coma scale 7, tied down to a hospital bed. The nurse told me that I had tried to get up before. The nurse said that if I fell down, he would be responsible. When I woke from the coma, I was partially paralyzed, and I could not walk. I could barely talk, and I could not use my right arm and right hand. I stayed tied down for another week or two until I was sent to Letterman Army Medical Center. It took a few months until I was able to walk again. Before the accident, I was active duty US Army. I was training for a 20-mile running race, and I was running close to 10 miles per day. I went from being in shape to being unable to walk 20 feet. Luckily I was wearing a seatbelt, and I had an airbag. I was medically retired from the US Army. TLDR, don't drive when you are tired. One day my mom called me telling me, the cops are surrounding your dad's house. He's outside in cuffs covered in blood. Are stepmom and the kids okay? And I went into a panic. I drove like a madman. My stepmom met me at the home and my siblings were luckily at school. My dad had beat my uncle to a pulp and shot him. He's alive, praise goodness. Crime scene wouldn't clean until we cleaned personal belongings, fridge, deep freeze, etc. So I took it upon myself to help my stepmom. When we walked in the house, it was like a horror film, from the kitchen, to the bathroom, to the bloody handprint slid down the door. Some of it wasn't dried after the 8 hours we sat outside. Some things were left behind like a bloody splinted chair leg. I ended up miscarrying the next day. It absolutely ruined me. Worse off. My dad, I've feared most of my life, may get off easy on these charges even as a known felon and repeat offender due to some circumstances. Special needs uncle can't recall the story. And uncle was on meth at the time of attack. Dad was just drunk as usual. However, spent years saying he'd kill him if he got the chance, as he hated how slow he was, waiting to find out whether or not my two best friends survived two separate near-death experiences. One was supposed to be at the Pulse nightclub the night of the shooting but canceled his plans at the last moment. I woke up to headlines about the shooting on my phone the next morning. The other was rescued from a suicide attempt, and there was about 4 hours between her being taken to the hospital and stabilized. Just waiting for hours, sitting by my phone waiting for any news, was agony. I've lived through some traumatizing stuff. Having a history of childhood sexual abuse, and nothing was worse than the span of time where I thought I'd lost my system of unconditional love and support. I had a jaw infection that doctors and dentists couldn't find for over a year and a half. The infection spread from my jaw, to my nose, to my ears, and finally to my brain. They finally found the issue after I collapsed on the streets and they rushed me to the hospital. A dentist had badly removed one of my teeth that left a hole and it got infected. I had to wait 3 months to get the surgery and they gave me a shitload of medication in the meantime. During the heat wave, not being able to breathe properly, side effects from morphine and antibiotics, severe and constant diarrhea, C. diff infection, blocked nose and blocked ears. All my senses were fucked and I couldn't handle the heat. It was 3 agonizing months. I was all alone because my immune system was shot. Risk of me getting COVID were high, so nobody came to visit. I was lonely, lost, in pain, lost 35 pounds, lost a part of myself, went insane, thought about suicide a lot. I'm not sure what kept me going. Maybe because I didn't want my mom to bury her son after burying her husband 2 years ago. This all happened this year. I got my surgery 2 weeks ago and it was successful. I'm now slowly trying to get back to a normal life, but those 3 months have changed me forever. The Rammstein airshow disaster. I was very young at the time, so I barely remember it. Probably still alive because I wanted to stay and look at the tanks instead of watching the tricolory. Edit, barely remember it and I didn't even remember the tanks until we saw it on TV several years ago. Wow, that looks bad, I said. You were there, said my mom. I went onto the Verrückt water slide at Schlitterbahn. If it sounds familiar, it was the water slide that was the tallest water slide in 2014 and was also the same water slide that a young boy died from decapitation. I went on this ride a month before the boy died. So the ride had a narrow raft that had 3 seats in a single row. I remember sitting on the back of the raft and looking for a seat belt or safety harness, only to find out the only thing strapping you in was a Velcro strap that went over one shoulder. That was it. And as soon as we went down the first drop, the Velcro strap instantly came undone and I started to feel myself lift out of my seat. Horrified it felt as time moved slowly as I grabbed onto these somewhat loose cheap nylon straps that were supposed to pass as handles, but they were so loose that I ended up gripping onto inner material of the raft as hard as I could and agonizing on the fact that I had to go through another drop. The ride itself was less than a minute long, but it felt so much longer. Once we reached the bottom of the slide, I sat there momentarily stunned at what had just happened, and the rest of my family that was waiting at the end of the slide came up to me unaware of what had just happened and was shocked when they saw me still sitting in the raft trembling and tears streaming down my face. When I told my family what happened, we informed the lifeguard that was monitoring at the bottom of the slide, and they said they would report the raft I was on and inspect it. I was in shock the rest of the time at the water park and didn't go on any other rides after that either. I told as many people as I could about the lax safety precautions that ride had, and then a month passed and I saw the incident with the death of the boy on the same ride and instantly got chills. It sunk in that I really could have died the same way that poor boy did if I wouldn't have had a death grip on the sides of the raft. Sorry for my bad English in advance. I was skiing down the mountain. Usual stuff. Relaxing turns. Fast straight sections. It was one of those straight sections when my ski locked into the trail in the snow. It was deep enough to hold the ski hard enough so no matter how hard I tried to turn or raise it I wasn't able to. Without falling, and then I felt it. Feeling of true fear and impending doom. Speed was raising. Trail going straight into the tight forest route, where if you make one mistake you hug the tree to stop and not crash into another. And here I was. Speed around 90 to 100 kilometers per hour. Real steep track. Heavy gear, with one leg leading me straight into the forest. My mind went full blank. No memories flashing. No such thing. On other hand, I feel every drop of sweat coming out of my skin. Time slowed to a crawl. And then my mind got to the state of absolute concentration. Adrenaline levels was so high that didn't feel anything. I just thought about turning. And suddenly I did. I got to the resting place. And only now it all hit me at once. Absolute fear. Immense headache. Pain from twisted leg and dislocated foot. I fell instantly. Pain wasn't so bad. I broke bones before. But coupled with fear and exhaustion it was too much to hold in. Thanks to kind people I'm now okay. But because of this experience now I seek that feeling of danger and speed. Thanks for your time. Hope you'll have a great day. Trying to talk to every adult in my life for fucking years about what's wrong with me. I needed therapy pretty fucking bad. But everyone I knew were members of my parents' extremist right-wing church. You could tell these people the darkest shit and they would pray for you. This was the only solution I was ever given until I got kicked out at 17. I'm surprised I survived. My life changed so much when I was in high school and they forced me to see a therapist. Good God, I fucking needed that. It's a miracle I never got killed or ended my life during a wave of depression. I had major problems as a kid with zero real guidance. I don't want to go into extreme detail, but I had very violent tendencies, never-ending waves of depression, and horrible thoughts. I often look back at who I was and cringe. It took years before I finally understood I'm not mentally well and needed to face that problem before I'll ever be able to connect with others socially. The dying breaths of my father. You sit there, you know it's inevitable, but you just can't stop hoping that he's going to make the miraculous recovery, and you just are terrified that every labored may have been his last.